I do give Reagan a substantial amount of credit for contributing to the end of the Cold War, to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I'm not alone in feeling that way. A lot of Soviet dissidents will say the same thing, that Reagan gave them encouragement. And somebody like Lech Walesa, the first democratically elected president of Poland, said the same thing as well. Margaret Thatcher once said that Ronald Reagan won the Cold War without firing a shot. I think there's quite a bit to support that statement.
This is Tony Williams, a senior fellow at BRI, and we are pleased to bring you the fifth and final episode of the Cold War and the Presidency series with Steve Knott on Reagan and the Cold War. In this series, our main question will really be on how individual presidents have shaped executive powers during the Cold War. And by way of introduction, Stephen F. Knott is a professor of national security affairs at the Naval War College. He co-chaired the Presidential Oral History Program and directed the Reagan Oral History Project at the UVA Miller Center. And he's written extensively on the presidency, including Washington and Hamilton, the alliance that forged America. We actually wrote that one together, Steve. The Reagan years, also at Reagan's side. And his most recent book, The Lost Soul of the American Presidency, which was actually a subject of a very popular two-part scholar talk that we did back in January. And his website is www.stephenfknott.com. Steve, thanks again for joining us.
Really. Well, thanks for having me, Tony. It's always a pleasure to reconnect with you, my favorite co-author of all time. You and I were like the Lennon and McCartney of the publishing world.
That's right. Now, have you co-authored the books with anyone else? No.
No, one other.
Okay, but I'm the favorite. Okay.
You're number one.
Well, very good. Well, I couldn't think of a better scholar to talk about Ronald Reagan with. You've done a tremendous amount of work with him, a lot of scholarship. So let's dive right in here. So for several decades, Reagan really had an understanding of Soviet communism as an immoral system, as a system that was destined for, as he put it, the ash heap of history. While president, he called it an evil empire. Can you understand, can you explain rather, why Reagan had this view and this understanding, this moral vision of communism and how it shaped his approach to the Cold War?
Yeah, terrific question, Tony. I think some of the foundation for Reagan's understanding of communism can be found in his deep religious faith. I know there was a tendency while he was president, since he wasn't a regular churchgoer, since he was our first divorced president, since he wasn't necessarily known perhaps as a devoted family man when it came to relationships with his own children, there was a kind of skepticism at the time about Reagan's spirituality, about his religious beliefs. But in fact, this was a deeply spiritual or deeply religious man who had inherited strong religious beliefs from his mother, Nell Wilson Reagan, who was a very active member of a Protestant church in Iowa called the Disciples of Christ. And I'm convinced that Ronald Reagan sort of absorbed a lot of that strong religious faith from his mother. And the fact that the Soviet Union was upfront about its atheistic nature was one of the major reasons why Reagan, I think, was hostile to Soviet communism. And I would just add one other point as well. Reagan was a firm believer in American exceptionalism, the notion that the United States was a providentially destined nation, or at least the inhabitants of this nation were destined to inhabit it. And, that American exceptionalism, that fierce patriotism that Reagan possessed, coupled with strong religious beliefs, again, led him to a rejection of Marxism, Leninism, and in particular on atheistic grounds, but also just the tendency to suppress individual liberty.
Right, great. And so he really thought détente in the 1970s was sort of even a naive and self-defeating idea that allowed the Soviet Union to engage in this massive arms buildup in the 70s, and also, sort of on these expansionary kind of adventurism around the world, really around the whole globe. I'm thinking here Latin America and Asia, Africa, certainly in Afghanistan, their invasion there. What was Reagan's alternative when he became president to what he saw as a failed policy of détente?
So Reagan's alternative policy was, as he put it to one of his national security advisors, we win. We win the Cold War. And that was fairly radical thinking, as you mentioned, Tony, in the 1970s. Both Republican and Democratic administrations under Nixon, Ford, and Carter had pursued this policy of détente, which was a policy of engagement on the trade front, on cultural exchanges, space exploration, but also the pursuit of various arms control agreements. Reagan believed that Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, along with Presidents Ford and Carter, had perhaps given away too much to the Soviet Union, and that the Soviets had used this era of détente to mention, as you mentioned, to expand abroad throughout the Third World, what we called then the Third World. And so again, he took a more assertive stance and came to believe that the United States could defeat the Soviet Union, not in any sort of war. The notion that Reagan was a warmonger, I think, was very much off the mark. But he did believe that our economy, the Western capitalist system, could leave the communist system on the ash heap of history, as he said in his speech to the British Parliament in 1982. So he was determined to win the Cold War. To boil it down, I would say he was determined to spend the Soviet Union into the ground. And he was firmly convinced that if we got into something of an arms race with the Soviets in the 1980s, we would win and they would lose. Now, again, these policies were very controversial, but I would argue there's at least some evidence to support the contention that those policies contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Right, and that's a great segue for my next question, relating to even his broader critique of containment itself, which goes all the way back to the Truman administration and the beginning of the Cold War. That he seems like he's not settling for just the status quo. That he really sought policies that purposefully, if you want to call it, roll back Soviet communism, or as you put it, quoting him, we win. And so what policies did he pursue to really apply that severe pressure to the Soviet Union?
Well, the key policy, at least in Reagan's mind, was the largest defense buildup in the history of the United States. I've even read it was the largest defense buildup in the history of the world. I don't know how they measure such things, but I've read that somewhere, but it was enormous. Basically, anything the military wanted. The Navy wanted to bring out some battleships that had been mothballed since the Second World War. That was done. They were equipped with cruise missiles. Reagan gave the Air Force the B-1 bomber that President Carter had rejected. The Army was given all sorts of new tanks and new weaponry. It was just an incredible buildup of American military force, in addition to some nuclear weapons as well, the MX missile based in the United States and various ground-launched cruise missiles based in Western Europe. Both of those two last decisions that I mentioned were extremely controversial and led to the formation of a nuclear freeze movement. This is perhaps as good a time as any as to say Reagan's hatred of communism, interestingly enough, was equaled by his hatred of nuclear weapons. And he believed by bringing the Soviets to the negotiating table, by showing them that they were not going to be able to outspend us on defense equipment, he could make incredible progress towards limiting nuclear weapons and fulfilling his ultimate dream, which was the elimination of all nuclear weapons.
Right, and again, another great segue into my next question. Many people don't know that about Reagan, that he really hated nuclear weapons, was sort of horrified at the prospect of a nuclear war, as the most reasonable people were, and really saw it as sort of not just an existential threat to mankind, to humankind, but really a practical threat as well. And so, how does Reagan specifically work to achieve this goal? I'm thinking of some summits and some work, especially later on with Gorbachev. And how is that related, very interestingly, to the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, or what its detractors called Star Wars?
Yeah, great question, Tony. And I should have included SDI or Star Wars in my litany of defense projects that President Reagan supported and secured funding for from Congress. That one in particular was critical. The Soviets were very afraid of the technological prowess of the West and of the United States. And I think came perhaps to believe that we would be able to create some sort of missile shield or missile defense system that would render their ability to strike the United States with these nuclear missiles, would render that moot. So that scared them, it bothered them. Again, their economy was strapped, and to have to invest in all sorts of high-tech equipment to sort of get around this potential missile defense was an issue of concern for them. I should also mention, Tony, that Reagan's Evil Empire speech, which I think you alluded to earlier, includes this proposal for SDI and makes a defense of his other military expenditures. It's also a speech where he warns, it was to a group called the National Association of Evangelicals. He warns members of the religious community not to view the United States and the Soviet Union through the same lens. He really does make a distinction between the American system and the Soviet system. But interestingly enough, in this speech to a group of relatively conservative evangelicals, where Reagan condemns the Soviet Union as an evil empire, he also makes the point of noting that the United States had its own history of evil. And it's a reference to the American system of slavery and its after effects in terms of impacting equal justice for all. It's interesting to note that that aspect of the Evil Empire speech to this day never gets the attention I believe it deserves. He was saying that both systems had a legacy of evil. Ours, we were attempting to overcome. The Soviet Union, he believed, wasn't even making the attempt. Right.
Very, very interesting. Yeah. So final question, Reagan, thinking about Reagan and the presidency here, it seems to me that he had a very strong moral vision, as we've talked about, and some, incredible rhetorical skills that seemed a really important approach to an important part of his approach to the Cold War. And that he also seemed to restore, let's say, some strength and dignity to the office after some of the reverses of Vietnam, certainly Watergate, and other problems around the 70s. As an expert on the Reagan presidency, what impact do you think Reagan's approach to the Cold War had on the executive office, on the presidency?
Yeah, it's a great question again. And Reagan comes into office in January 1981. I think 5 of his immediate predecessors had left office under duress. Kennedy had been assassinated. Johnson chose not to run. Nixon forced to resign. Ford defeated. Carter defeated. There was lots of talk in 1980 that the American presidency no longer worked, and that perhaps America itself was in decline, not only the presidency, but the entire American system. I think by the time Reagan leaves office, most of that talk is in the rearview mirror, so to speak. Reagan, I think, breathed some renewed life into the American presidency, partly due to, I think, a very important understanding on Reagan's part that the president serves as a head of state. And Reagan loved that role of delivering those moving speeches that you alluded to earlier, in which he appealed, I would say, to the better angels of our nature. So he breathes life into the American presidency that needed it, I think. And also in terms of our standing around the globe and vis-a-vis the Cold War, by the time Reagan leaves office, the Soviet Union is starting to crumble. And I think it's just a matter of a year or two after Reagan's departure from office that the collapse is complete. That's a pretty impressive record. Now, I have some criticisms of Reagan on certain domestic issues, but that's not the focus of our talk today. I do give Reagan a substantial amount of credit for contributing to the end of the Cold War, to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I'm not alone in feeling that way. A lot of Soviet dissidents will say the same thing, that Reagan gave them encouragement. And somebody like Lech Walesa, the first democratically elected president of Poland, said the same thing as well. Margaret Thatcher once said that Ronald Reagan won the Cold War without firing a shot. I think there's quite a bit to support that statement.
Great. Steve, thank you for a very, very interesting conversation. The Lost Soul of the American Presidency is your latest book, and we thank you for sharing your expertise today.
Thank you, Tony. I enjoyed every minute of it.
And thank you for joining us for our mini curriculum video series on the Cold War and the presidency. Check out our other episodes on FDR, Truman, Kennedy, and Nixon and Kissinger, with interviews with several leading historians on this very important topic. Thank you.